down below. God leads us to health. There was a gentleman who went to see his doctor for help, and right away the doctor noticed that there were some problems. Out of one of his ears was a banana. Sticking out one of the other ears was a carrot. One nostril had a green bean, the other a piece of celery. The doctor looked at him for just a moment and says, "I don't need to examine you. I know what your problem is." He says, "Really? That was fast. You're not eating properly." Okay, it's supposed to be funny. Think about it. All right. We're going to talk about how Jesus brings health. But not just in the way of healings, but in all ways of our life. We've been talking as we've gone through Mark that Jesus does not come to fix all of the problems of our world. He comes to prepare the church to fix all the problems. Lately we've talked about the way that there's been these battles. Battles that take the disciples away from what they should be doing. And battles that show the disciples how they are to act. Jesus sends his disciples out, then he pulls them back in. They go through this time of refocusing. They go through that feeding the 5,000 that I mentioned a moment ago, where compassion overcomes cold hearts. He walks on the water, helps them to overcome fear. Now the disciples and Jesus travel together around the area of the Galilee, and great crowds come around with great needs. Great crowds come around with great needs. Why was Jesus there? We've talked about this purpose of preparing the disciples to release the church to go and change the world. Yet here it is, the world's beating down on Jesus' door. They don't always necessarily follow our example. They don't want to meet with the disciples. They want to meet with Jesus. I can understand that. But it is pulling Jesus a little bit away from his purposes. But with it, we get some great reminders of the way in which God works. So let's talk about the then. What's happening in this story? Jesus meets their needs. Now you can see this. Jesus is going around through the countryside. And the place goes crazy. Everybody is yanking out their iPhones. They're tweeting people and telling them, "Hey, Jesus is here." Or something like that. I had a big event this week. I doubled the amount of Twitter followers I have. I moved from 1 to 2. Jeff's one. Way to go, Jeff. My brother's the other one. Anyways, they're going around and they're spreading the word. Yes, Jesus is in the vicinity. Jesus is here. And I don't know, it's amazing the way they can communicate quickly before these things are invented, isn't it? But the word spreads from place to place. Jesus is there, and then Jesus in this town, Jesus in that town, and the crowds gather, and they don't even have to see Jesus. They start bringing those who are sick to the marketplaces, to the center of town, and the crowds are there. All sorts of things that need to be fixed. Ills that need to be healed. Injustices that need to be made right. And everything comes to Jesus. Why? Because he can fix them. He can fix them. They rush to see him. I have 3 thoughts about this story that really strike me right away. One of them is that Jesus gave up his agenda. I've read this story a few times. When I say a few times, I mean a lot of times. And there is something that I have never picked up on until this week. They get out in the boat, the disciples. They're rowing to get across the lake, right? They're on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus tells them, "I want you to go on to the east side, and I will meet you on the east side." Then partway through the night, Jesus comes down the mountain. He starts walking. It talks about him even starting to pass the disciples on the boat. He is going from the west side to the east side, and that's where he's going to go work. That doesn't quite end up happening that way. He gets on the boat. He calms the winds down. They end up back on the west side, though. They don't finish the journey over to the east side. They're back on the same side that they started, not in the exact same location. They moved a little bit north. But Jesus had this plan, and I don't know exactly why the plan is changed so much. But I do know this, that Jesus had this command out. We're going over here. But he laid that plan aside. In fact, it looks like it's quite a long time before they make it back to the other side. They needed to stay on that side of the lake. And Jesus has to lay his agenda aside. How about that? You ever feel inconvenienced by people? I sure do. The people kind of get in the way of what we need to do. Well, it happened to Jesus. You think as Son of God, he could have done something about that. But he doesn't. The needs of these people comes first. He puts his agenda aside. It was interesting as I was even writing this, that I was looking up, kind of my desk faces a window. I saw that there was a vehicle that I didn't recognize was pulling into the parking lot. And parking, I'm thinking, I don't have time for somebody. I've got to get this sermon written. Yeah, it's easy to happen, isn't it? It's easy for it to happen that we forget what really matters because we've got things to get done. Secondly, Jesus saw service as all important. Jesus, when I think of him and think of the great things he does, I think of the teacher that he was, the mentor, the preparer. Those were the things that Mark really points out he came to do. And yet what was the biggest adjective, word that we could come to describe Jesus, what profession really marked Jesus, and it was servant. Servant. Not king. Not sovereign. Servant. And thirdly, he met people in their needs as best he could. He went out of his way for people. It's easy to think, can't these people fix their own problems? Can't they look after themselves? I read this week where an author was writing that gratitude, this is the exact quote, gratitude is the accent of the language of heaven. Because there everything is undeserved grace. No creature that basks in the eternal, deep, powerful, satisfying, overflowing joys of heaven will have merited being there. Each will be there solely by the grace of God, which is why we all sing. And so what that is saying is this, that the way that we speak when we're in heaven, not necessarily literally in heaven, but citizens of heaven, is about being just thankful about everything, including when our agenda gets broken, because we understand that we've no right to do anything or be anywhere except by the grace of God. There is nothing that is in my life that is more important than the grace and love of Jesus. That's what matters. And that should change the very way I speak and the way that I look at life. So I get interruption in life. Well, thank God that I have the opportunity to do his ministry. We need to be like Jesus. We need to be like him. That author that I just quoted, by the way, goes on to talk about grumbling. And he says if gratitude is the language of heaven, guess where grumbling comes from? It is the language of hell. He says this, it's how a creature's pride responds to the Creator's decision to do or allow something that the creature does not desire. Grumbling scorns God because it elevates our desires and judgments above His. Well, that's harsh. Our world is more full of grumbling, isn't it? Jesus had his entire program interrupted by all these people coming around him. And he just responds as a servant. So does it play a role in the now? Does the church play a role in meeting needs? I think there is a dramatic change that is coming in the church. That there is no room anymore for churches or even denominations that are focused only on themselves. I was reading one author this week who was talking about there are a lot of churches that, what marks them? Justice? That they're Bible-believing? Says there's some that are even all about feel good. They try to sound like Oprah in the preaching. Feeling good about yourself. There's all sorts of agendas that can come up. And this author said, so where are the servant churches? Where are the churches that are marked by service? And they are out there. I'm hoping that in some little way we might be one of them. Maybe not as fully as we should be. The church has often, in the modern day, become discredited and seen as irrelevant in our society. And oftentimes the church is shrinking. But maybe it is God who is forcing a change in the church, who is forcing us to reevaluate what is important. A week and a half ago that I had the opportunity to be part of our pastor's retreat, and I talked a little bit about some things I learned actually last week. One of the neat things is we get to hear stories of what God is doing. Some of the stories aren't always uplifting. But we hear some stories also are. And I want to just tell you some of the stories I heard. Real quick, and I wish I could go into the details that I heard, but I think it illustrates the difference sometimes between the church and Jesus, or maybe where the church is like Jesus. I heard the story of a church in our denomination, I'm sad to say, but not in our area, not in our province, but in our country, that had become so inward focused, so fighting amongst themselves, so worried about, their own comforts and wants, that they had become, according to our denomination, a stench in the community. And God has stepped in a miraculous way and killed that church. Does that sound right? What will close a church? Could people close a church? Do you think people can overcome if God wanted a church to stay open? And God stepped in, actually our denomination stepped in, sold the building, and gave the money to the other evangelical churches in that community, saying, take this money and use it to repair the damage done to the gospel by our church. I've told this story a couple of times with another church, actually in Edmonton, again of our denomination. When I first told the story of this church, it was a church that was so fearful of the world out there, so upset about what they saw among people, so focused on their own comfort and what they wanted, that they had grown cold to the community around them. And I told the story, this was a number of years ago, and I repeated it about a year ago, that in this church they had a meeting in which they said, you know what, if we're going to stay alive, we need to start finding ways to bring people back into our church. They were a very elderly church. They didn't care about having people in. They didn't want young people in their church. And somebody got up at the meeting and said, you know what, if we start to implement some of these changes you're talking about, it could even happen that somebody with green hair might show up at our church. And the next Sunday, a sanely old 80-year-old man showed up with green hair. And then I changed the story about a year ago and said, do you know what has happened though? That church didn't change and that church has died. They closed the doors. Well, I'm going to tell you the next part of that story. That church is in a very strategic part of Edmonton. The denomination did not sell the building in this case. A group of young Chinese believers has stepped up and said, you know what? When we look around this neighborhood, we're seeing a lot of new immigrants who are falling beneath the cracks. They cannot get health care. They cannot access a lot of the things that are basic in our society. We have a lot of people in our community, our church, who are medical. We can help meet their needs. And we can also help them with their children and some of the needs they need to learn English. So we've got a group of 20-something Chinese people who stepped out of faith, raised thousands of dollars to renovate this church, and are now using it to win young Muslims to Christ, who are serving young Muslims and Hindus. They bypassed those. God has bypassed those who didn't want to serve and has now brought these ones to the cause of Christ. I heard of another church in Edmonton, not of our denomination, that was closed. Same thing. This was a church that prided themselves in being Bible-believing. And it's a nice thing to say that. It's another thing to live it. Just because you say you're conservative and Bible-believing does not mean you're in the will of God. God closed that church. Today, this morning, it's full of Spanish young people, that building. Spanish-speaking young people who are gathering together to worship God. And God, again, killed that church so that this other group of young Spanish believers would have a place to gather and to worship. I heard the story of an Iranian church in Canada, which read in James chapter 5 about God saying, call together the elders, anoint the sick with oil, and pray for them. And they phoned up the denominational leadership and said, are we allowed to do that? He said, yeah, you bet. And so they gathered together a whole lot of people recently this year of an Iranian background and said, if you're sick, let's gather together and see what God does. And God supernaturally healed a number of people right in front of the congregation. I heard the story of a Punjabi church for those of Sikh backgrounds in Calgary. Some of you have been involved in some of these programs to read the Bible in a year. They have a bunch of new believers said, we need to know the Bible. And so they committed to challenge each other to read the Bible 7 times in the year 2013. Now, it wasn't working out so well because they wanted to read in different spots, and they all thought, oh, those English people, they pull out their phones and read off this. But there's no app for that in our Bible. So they individually, one member took every single page out of here and scanned it into a PDF file. If you've done this, you know how long this would take. I can't even imagine how many hours. So that the rest of them can read all the time. And what's happening is they're sitting around reading it, and they work in places where there's Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus, and they're coming to them and saying, so what are you reading? We heard the story of a bus driver. Initially, they started mocking him, so you're going to start preaching to us too? But as he sat there and read it every day, some of the Muslims started asking, would you read it to us? This is in Calgary. God's at work. I have another story. I actually have a list here. I'm not going to get to them. Do you know, one other interesting one that happened at our retreat. They called up Ann Stevens, and they asked her, would you come and just talk for a minute? And so on. Oh, great. Dear somebody I know. I've heard a lot enough. And she was being interviewed by Ron Brown, who's the head of missions for our province, who himself was actually a missionary for a number of years in both of the Congos in Africa. And they're talking for about a minute, and he said, actually, we've got a really neat story of the way churches can commit. And he looked out, and we've got about 700 pastors out there. I say, you guys, I want all 700 pastors to hear the story of a little church in Viking, Alberta. And I got called out. I was not expecting this. And said, you need to hear about, he said, I want you to hear this story of this little church in Viking, Alberta. And they asked me, so how is your church helping the church in Brazzaville, Congo? And I got to actually say that this church was one of the good stories. God, when we act as servants, can do great things. And I've seen that in our church. We have found ways to serve. Our carnival, our hockey ministry, blessing, but all sorts of things. But we need to come up with more creative ways to meet the needs of our community and our world. And I think God is asking our church to go out and bring more hope to the world. I mentioned this meeting on Wednesday night. I'm hoping a few people show up at least. We need sometimes to be challenged because we can become comfortable and complacent in what we are doing and miss what's happening around us. We can become so good at sometimes at doing things like Sunday school or whatever the case may be. But actually, we're so good at it, we don't need God. And I think God sometimes comes in and challenges us to do something new to meet the needs of our world, because otherwise we become complacent. We need to keep on our toes. But there's an always component of this too. Jesus goes and he meets the needs of his area, and he does it specifically through healing. He heals people. Do you know what's interesting? Jesus has a reputation as a healer. He is known for healing. It might not be the one he wanted. I have a sinking suspicion Jesus might have preferred to be known as a great teacher. But this is what his reputation became. He was known as the great healer. But he heals all. Isn't it interesting that it doesn't ask everybody, hey, do you know what? I'll heal you if you commit to becoming a disciple. I'll heal you if you agree to do this for me. He just heals. Ultimately, we are whole physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Because of the cross, spiritually, there is something called sanctification, where God is at work. Yet I still sin, but because God is at work, I am becoming more like him, and one day I know I shall be fully like him. Emotionally, because of the cross, I see signs, I may not see signs, but I see signs in other people that they are maturing. They may not have full wisdom yet, but maturity is growing in their lives because of what God has done. And physically, sickness and death may still have some hold over me, but healing shows the promise that one day I shall be whole. I read this and I see God cares about ourselves physically, and it does say something about the fact That not only do we just rely on Him, just like in sanctification, we try to grow physically, I think we need to look after our bodies. I think that is scriptural. But Jesus goes around healing. This is not a teaching of the church that can be dropped. This is what the church needs to be known for. There should be more healings, but somehow we just lack the faith. We need to be people who pray that God works supernaturally. In James chapter 5, I already mentioned that there's this passage about elders anointed with oil. It's not a magic formula. It is a way that we can show the power of the Holy Spirit. But Jesus heals in all sorts of different ways in the Scripture. We need to pray more and more fervently. We need to pray harder. We need to use more of our time to pray. The bottom line is, we can lose our dependence on God. Medically, things are so much better than they were in the time of Jesus. But death still takes hold, and as a result, we cannot lose that need for Jesus. We need to need Jesus. And healing is part of how God works in our lives and in our world around us. When I think of all this and I think of being a servant, it all comes back to this. Do we do what we like? Do we do what we want? Do we do what feels comfortable? Or do we follow Jesus? And when Jesus is part of our lives and when Jesus is here, it's amazing the difference that it makes.